Have you ever pulled up a chord chart for your favorite jazz standard and been overwhelmed by the amount of chords on the sheet? The reality is that you can understand most of what's going on by understanding one simple chord progression. And in this video, I'm going to break down that chord progression and the most common substitutions around it so that you can both learn tunes faster and start to make your own decisions about harmony. Hop on over to my website, grab the free PDF to follow along with this because I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. But before we get started, I want you to comment your favorite jazz standard, and I'm going to show you where this chord progression and some of the variations occur in that specific piece. Let's get started. If you remember one thing from this lesson, remember these four numbers: 1, 6, 2, 5. This basic chord progression is the harmony that underpins the vast majority of the Great American Songbook, which are the tunes that almost all jazz standards are based around. Now, we're not worried about fancy chords here. If you want to learn all of the chord voicings that you need, click this link up here and go through my videos on jazz chords on uke. Here we are worried about the sounds of the chord progressions themselves and how they work. Let's look at this chord progression in the key of C. Our 1 chord is going to be a C. We'll count up 6 from that and we get A, and it's going to be an A minor 7th. Our 2 chord will be D minor 7th, and our 5 chord will be G 7th. So let's try that together, starting on C. 2, 3, 4. 1, 6 chord, A minor 7th. D minor 7th is 2. Back to G 7th. And where does that go? Back to C, right? That G 7th forces our ear to C. And this is the important thing to understand, is this chord progression is actually even simpler than this. It's really substitutions for 2 chords. The simplified harmony is just tension and release. We have the release, or the home, stable sound of a C chord, and then we have the tension of our 5 chord, the G 7th. G 7th pushes our ear back to C. So when we look at C to A minor 7th, our 1 to 6th, you probably hear that they sound very similar to each other. We're actually just adding a note to our C chord, and this is such an easy thing to see on uke, because where's our uke tuned to? C 6th, a C chord with an A added to it, the same as an A minor 7th. This 1 and 6 chord we can think of as interchangeable in harmony. They're different shades of the same color. And likewise, the D minor 7th and the G 7th are linked to each other. They share 2 common tones on our middle strings, the D and the F. The D minor 7th is our sound setting up that tension of the G 7th. It's starting to push us to the C. This is called a subdominant sound. So 2, 5, 1. But what's important to know here? Whenever we see just a C chord, we can try playing a C or an A minor 7th. Either will work. Whenever we see a G 7th chord or a 5 chord within a key, we can substitute a 2-5-1 as well. So let's look at how we can take this one step further. We've already established that C and A minor 7th are very closely related chords, and really for us as chord players, what we would call them depends on what your bass player is playing or what's happening in the full context of the song. If it's okay with the melody, we can use them interchangeably. And likewise, we have a 3rd chord that says our same stable sound as the 1 chord, which is our 3 chord. So if we count up C, D, E, an E minor 7th chord can be substituted for our 1 chord. So that changes our chord progression from 1, 6, 2, 5 to 3, 6, 2, 5. But why can we do this? Well, if we're looking at our C chord here, our E minor 7th that we're playing actually keeps 2 tones here. And what we're adding are the B and D. So effectively what's happening is we're adding the major 7th to the chord, and we're adding the major 9th to the chord. So these are very similar sorts of sounds. The E minor 7th, our 3 chord, is a different shade of harmony of the 1 chord, just like the A minor 7th is. So when we think of C, we can actually intersperse this 3 chord over top as well. The 1, 3, and 6 can be used by chordal players nearly interchangeably, as always, if it suits the melody at the time. So we can play the same chord progression, E minor 7th, 3, to A minor 7th, 6, to D minor 7th, to G 7th. resolves us back to C again. But you can also think of this E minor 7th, this shape that we use, as a C major 9 chord. They're saying the same exact thing depending on what everyone else is doing around you. So you can experiment with this 3-6-2-5-1 sound to find a new color for your 1 chord. Let's take it a little bit further. Remember I said that we have two basic sounds, stable and unstable, right? The sound of that 7th chord, that G7th, is giving us that unstable sound pushing us somewhere. And we can take that further by taking the 3-6-2-5 that we just played, our E minor 7th, A minor 7th, D minor 7th, G7th, and we can make all of these dominant chords, creating motion from one into the other, more strongly leading us back to the ultimate goal of release at C. So we play 3-6-2-5, but as dominant chords. And this is such an important progression that it has a name. This is the rhythm changes bridge that is used so much throughout the bebop era. This is the bridge from George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. And we think of this as rather far away from our basic 1-6-2-5, but it's actually not. It's a dominant substitution for it. And I'll tell you in a moment what we're doing here, but I want to play it so we can hear the sound first, because hearing is what's important. So we start on E7th now instead of E minor 7th, A7th instead of A minor 7th, D7th instead of D minor 7th, and we keep our G7th. 2, 3, 4. A7th, D7th, and G7. Now in a rhythm changes bridge, this would be 2 measures apiece, but for now we're just worried about the chords themselves. So what's happening here is what's called a secondary dominant. We are taking a dominant chord, right? The chord that says tension, guide me to this place, from the chord we're going to. Dominant chords always want to resolve up a 4th. E wants to go to A wants to go to D wants to go to G7. And by making these dominant chords with this substitution, we're creating a more strong sense of motion to the next chord that brings us ultimately back to rest at C. Let's take this a step further. A very important sound in jazz is the tritone sub, and this is one that I didn't wrap my head around for quite a long time because of how it was taught to me. So I hope that this is a little bit easier for you to understand than when I was originally learning jazz harmony. Now we're going to take our same exact progression, our 3-6-2-5, all dominant chords, and we're going to throw 2 tritone substitutions in there. So what does that mean? We're inserting the chord that shares the tritone with the chord that we're replacing. And it's up a sharp 4 or flat 5 away from that. That's a terrible way to think of it functionally in music. Think of it this way. What is a dominant chord doing? It's targeting that next chord, right? If you know your circle of fifths and circle of fourths, you'll start to know where it is targeting. All that we're doing is we're playing a dominant chord a half step above our target. That's it. So if we look at the first one, we're starting on E7th, and then we're going to do our tritone substitution for A7th. Well, what are we targeting? We're targeting D7, so I'm just going to play an E flat 7, the same shape, a fret above. If you want a tritone substitution, play the dominant chord you're targeting, a fret above, and then resolve to it. Same thing. The tritone substitution for G7th is D flat 7th. Well, I'm targeting C. So there's my D flat 7. It's a half step or 1 fret above C. But let's look at what's actually happening here. So we hear this sound. Nice chromatic movement. Leading us back to C, but in a different way, right? And that's what's important. We're imparting a different sound with this harmony of a tritone substitution. But why does this work? So let's look at the 2 tritone substitutions. Our E flat is substituting for an A7th. So our A7th here and our E flat chord that we're playing, they share this tritone, this unstable interval. Look at this to this. The E and A strings are identical to each other. So we still have that sound of motion that wants us to go to the next chord. We still have that harmony pushing us there. But what you need to also remember is that all of these dominant chords, I'm going to link to my video here on this subject, come from your diminished 7th chord, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And both this E flat 7 and this A7th are contained in the same diminished 7th chord, which is why they can push us so much further than any other chord. So let's look at 2 tricks that we need to know about diminished 7th chords. There are really 2 ways that we use diminished 7th chords. We use a passing diminished 7th chord, and we use it as a substitution for a regular dominant 7th chord. So let's go back to our 1, 6, 2, 5, 1 to get ourselves in gear. So we have C, A minor 7th, D minor 7th, G 7th, right? Now we're going to use 2 diminished chords in here. From this C6, we're going to play the diminished chord on our 2nd fret. And you'll note that I don't have this labeled on the sheet because depending on what the bass player plays, it could be a host of different chords. We're just going to think of it as I'm playing a diminished 7th chord. But ask yourself, where are you targeting? That's the key. This passing diminished chord, where do I go next? D minor 7th. And you hear that motion of the chord with that passing diminished chord, making the 1 chord a diminished chord, coming on down. The passing diminished chord is pushing us down. The 2nd diminished chord we have here is in the last measure. In place of our G7th, we're playing this diminished chord on the 1st fret. But what's it doing? Well, here's G7th. We're just adding 1 note. It's still a G7th chord. It's a G7 with an added flat 9. All your diminished 7th chords are also dominant 7 flat 9s. And here it's just an extra spicy G7th chord. That's all that's happening. We don't even have to think of it as a diminished chord at all. So we have these 2 usages. We have our 1 chord to a passing diminished chord, to our 2 chord, to our G7 flat 9, which is a diminished substitution, but it's just our G7th chord. So remember this, a passing diminished chord is taking something and pushing to another chord down the neck of your instrument. When we're going back up, because this G7th wants to resolve here, we're usually using that diminished chord in place of a dominant 7th chord. So let's look at the last important sound that we need to be able to hear when we're looking at jazz harmony. Now I'm grouping 2 in this section. Some people might disagree with me, but as a bass player, I think it's the bass player's job to tell you what chords you're actually playing, which makes it actually a lot easier for us as chordal players because we can make decisions and have someone else change them into a different music theory concept while we're thinking the same exact thing. So I'm putting these 2 ideas, the backdoor dominant and the minor 4 chord, in the same exact camp. But let's look at this diminished chord that we have first. We're going to play C6 to a 3rd fret diminished chord. What's happening here? Well, it's an A7 flat 9 or it's a C7 flat 9. Who knows? What's your bass player playing? That's what matters. But just know it's essentially an A7th chord because where is it pushing us to? Well, it could be an F6 or it could be a D minor 7th. And whatever your bass player is playing is going to affect what that is. But for us, it's the same exact chord. We could think of it the same way. And then this last chord is what's so important. So let's listen to the whole progression. So again. Still bringing us back to C. And note that this is still built off that same diminished chord. So we think about this sound as either a 4 chord, an F chord going to an F minor, or what's called a backdoor dominant, which is a dominant chord that approaches from a whole step below. We're targeting C. So we're playing a B flat, in this case a B flat 9. We could play a B flat 7 as well, bringing us back to C. And this is just a different way of dominant functionality. So what we really need to start hearing are these little chord progressions that we're talking about. The first question is, how do we practice this? The first thing is memorize what's on the sheet, but then start playing each of them and playing the basic 1, 6, 2, 5 in between so that you hear how, say, the sound of a tritone substitution relates to this simple 1, 6, 2, 5, because it's all about starting to hear these sounds and then relating what our fingers are doing to how we make those sounds happen. Now the other thing is, you should know this in all 12 keys, right? Well, you should know it in all 12 keys, but do you need to practice in all 12 keys? No. Because our instrument has 4 strings, you can practice this in 4 different keys and get all of the movable positions that you will need. Because the key here is practicing the chord progressions and the sounds as a whole, not practicing 4 individual chords. but practicing a chunk of sound. So what 4 keys do we need? We need to be able to play in C, which would be the position we were just playing in. We need to be able to play in B flat, which would be this sort of position here as a B flat 6 chord or a B flat major 7 chord. We need to be able to play in the key of G, which we can practice right here. Here's a G 6th chord, or maybe we're on a G major 7th chord. And then we also need the key of F, which brings us down here. And again, watch my videos on all the chord voicings. It can take a long time to start to learn them, but once you have some of those diminished 7th, dominant 7ths, and major 6th chords under your fingers, start to transpose them on here. And I've done the transposition work for you on the handout with this lesson so that you can see what each and every chord that you will need in any given key is. This takes practice. It's methodical, but the more that you start practicing this, practicing hearing these sounds, the faster it will start to integrate itself into your playing. Now, the second part is starting to use this to learn tunes. So let's look at a song that contains every single one of these sounds. We're going to look at the song Time After Time, which you might have heard from Chet Baker. Time after time, I tell myself that I'm so lucky to be loving you. If you want to learn this song in total and go more in depth into the harmony, learn Chet's solo, Russ Freeman's piano part on here, adapted to uke, join over on the Tin Man's Magic Ukulele Club where we have a great 7-part lesson on this tune. But now let's look at all of these chord progressions that we're talking about in context of a song, because when we look at this page, it seems as though there's a lot going on, but it's not. It's just little substitutions that we were simply talking about. So it starts out with what progression? 1, 6, 2, 5. Time after time. Well, we know that. That's our basic progression. And then what happens? And this is Russ Freeman's harmony on piano. It goes 1 to 3, but we know that that 3 chord is just a substitution for the 1. All we're doing is playing a C major 7th here or a C major 9. It's not actually a different chord. So this whole first line is really just 1, 6, 2, 5, 1, 6, 2, 5 with that major 7 sort of substitution here. So time after time, I tell myself that I'm so lucky. Well, what happens here? C major 7th? When we're looking at a chart, we can ignore all of the extra 7ths, the flat 9s, all that stuff. When we're analyzing, it's just a C major chord. It's just our 1 chord, nothing fancy. And where's it go? Oh, it goes to an A minor 9. Forget the 9. It goes to our 6th chord. It goes 1, 6. And then what happens? Then we have 2 chords that look a little weird. We have B minor 7 flat 5 to E7 flat 9. Oh my gosh, what is this? We always want to look at where we're going when we see something that seems out of place. The E7 flat 9 looks weird. The B minor 7 flat 9 looks weird. But what's our next chord that we know? A minor 7th. Oh, it's going to the 6th chord. So what is this doing? Oh, this is that dominant function that we were talking about. That E7th chord, because we don't care about the flat 9, E7th leads us to A minor. This is our secondary dominant. So what's that B minor 7? Oh, that's 2, 5, 1, leading to our 6th chord. And this is why it's important to know what's happening in all keys and be able to play in all keys. So all that we're doing here, where these 2 chords look so out of place, is we're just using that same progression, 2, 5, going to the 6th chord in a different key. So we get to that 6th chord, and we just hang out there for a little bit. We're going to hang out on the A minor chord. And where did it go? E minor 9. Again, E minor. Oh, well, we already know that A minor, E minor, and C, they're all in the same realm, right? We're just sitting in that darker shade of C while we're playing this. But then we have 2 chords that are really out of place. E minor 7 flat 5 to A7 flat 9. So again, what are we looking at here? And we've seen those extensions before, so let's talk about that in a minute. But where's the next chord we know that fits in our puzzle piece of our bigger grand progression? Oh, it's that D minor 7th on evening, right? It's our 2 chord. Oh, what usually comes after our 2 chord? Our 5 chord. We'll look at that. But this explains those 2 chords before. The E minor 7 flat 5 to the A7 flat 9. Where's A7 want to go? We've seen this in our circle progression already. A7th wants to go to D, doesn't it? That's our dominant function. Again, that A7 flat 9 is leading us to D minor 7. So what is this? E minor 7 flat 5 to E7 flat 9. It's a 2-5-1 to our 2 chord. Again, we're just stepping out of the key, but we're still using that same exact progression. Now, when we're targeting a minor chord, many times you will see these extensions of a minor 7 flat 5 to a dominant 7 with a flat 9. That's just what happens in our harmonic minor scale. And you can play it. You can also just play a regular old 2-5-1 minor 7 to dominant 7, and it's going to be okay as long as it doesn't clash with the melody. The melody rules everything. So we're seeing in this section, it's just another 2-5-1 to 2, and then where's 2 want to go? Well, usually to 5, right? 2-5-1 is the end of our 1-6-2-5 progression, but we have this A flat 7 here. Oh my gosh, what is it? What's this A flat? Oh, it's just a half step above that G7th, isn't it? We're talking about when you're approaching something from a half step with a dominant chord. It's a tritone substitution. And this is a tritone substitution for what chord? For D7th, for our 2 chord. Sharing the same tritone, but what we're really thinking about here is, I'm just approaching that dominant chord from above. And there we have it, tritone substitution, G7th. So let's play the A section of this too, and I'm gonna call out what's happening so that we start to hear and feel it as we go. So we're starting on C. So we get 1, 6, 2, 5, 1, and then we're subbing that 3 chord, major 7 sound, 2, 5, hanging out on the 1 chord, 6, nice. 2, 5, 2, 6. Hear how it pushes you? You have nowhere to go but this A minor. And then E minor. Hear this weird little change. Where's it come from? But where's it pushing my ear to is the actual question. Ah, that D minor 7th. Now we're resolved tritone substitution to our 5 chord. And then the B section starts. We get C, A minor, D minor. Oh, it's the same exact thing. It's the same line, isn't it? We get 1, 6, 2, 5, 1 with that 3 substituting for the 1, 2, 5. And then we get over to our 1 chord, just as we did before, but now it does something different. It does C9. This is a dominant chord. Whenever we see just a 9th, it's the same as a C7. We're just adding on top of it. So where does C7th want to take us? We need to know those movement of fourths. C wants to go to F. Does it take us to F? You're darn right it does. Takes us to that 4 chord. This is an F6. No, this is very similar to our D minor 7th, right? Like we saw in that 4 to minor 4 thing. What happens if that happens? Oh, it does happen. If we look at the next bar, minor 4 to a B flat 7. So we get the minor 4 sound and the backdoor dominant, which are the same exact sound in this line. So let's listen to this line. So 1 7 chord leading us to the 4, minor 4, backdoor dominant. So we hear that approach getting us B flat backdoor dominant to C. And then what happens? 1, 6, minor 4. But what's minor 4 doing, right? Minor 4 here is always getting us back to 1. But instead we get this deceptive little trick here. It's going to the 3 chord, E minor 7th. But we know that's our 1 chord. 3, 6, 2. So we're doing the same exact movement here, and then we're just leaving out our 5 chord. We're not resolving that tension that we want to have. And then C, diminished passing chord in the last line, 2, 5, 1. There's nothing new here. These are all the sounds that we just talked about. You just need to get used to hearing them. So let's hear this last little bit, and I'll call out the sounds as we're playing it. So we start with the same lick. So we get 1, 6, 2, 5. 1 with that substitution of the 3, 2, 5. Major 7th, nice. It's dominant. Where's it leading us to? 4 to the minor 4 slash backdoor dominant sound. 1 going to 6 to 4. 3, 6, 2. We want to hear that 5, but the composer doesn't give it to us here. And then we get 1, passing diminished, 2, 5, 1. Try to find a couple other tunes in C and see if you can start to pick out some of these bigger chord progressions that we're talking about, as opposed to thinking about everything as individual chords. if you want to dive more into harmony and how to use these concepts in your own playing, because again, to me, the fun is making your own harmonic decisions. That's what we do over on the Magic Ukulele Club. We take one song per month and we do 6, 7, sometimes 8 lessons on it, going over the harmony, understanding the harmony, substitutions we can use, how to practice it, how to solo over top of it, all with a big PDF as well as a backing track to practice along with. Because the way to get good at playing music is by playing music.